Yet?
Okay. So this is the third week of our study of Passover. We have one more week of study next Sunday, and then we're going to do the Passover meal on the 14th. And we're going to, Scott and I are going to work on it this week. We're going to try to do it so we can assure us that we can do it both virtually and in person. Anybody who can come in person, we're very excited. I understand Virginia's hoping to be here. And I know Julie and Bob are going to be here, and we're really excited about some of our out-of-town folks going to be in person. So we studied that the Passover, the actual event happened at approximately 1300 BC. A year later, they remembered it the first time in the desert. God told the people to remember the Passover, do a Passover celebration every year. We don't know how many times they did it and how many times they didn't, but we know there was long periods of time they didn't do it. And in fact, in the Old Testament, there's only 6 mentions of the Passover, and then 5 times they celebrated it. Last week, we looked at the 4 other times they celebrated. What we know, just like us, is that we are stiff-necked, and even though God tells us to do something, we don't do it. And so the Jews were no exception to that. They didn't do it, but they did do it at some important times. This week, we're going to look at 2 things. We're going to look at 2 incidences in the New Testament, or in the Gospels, I should say, where the Passover is talked about. And then we're going to start looking at food in the first century. After today, when I get home, I will send out the recipes, just so you know, when we're going to do a first century Passover, which is different from the Passover of today. And one of the reasons it's different is because after Jesus died and was resurrected in 70 AD, the temple went down. And once the temple went down in Jerusalem, they celebrated Passover differently. And because of that, they did some different things with food. We're going to go back to as close as we think from historical documents what Passover meals look like in the first century. And so we're going to look at a little bit of that today. And with that, we are going to start with Luke.
Can I break in though? There's something Gene wrote this morning. I guess he couldn't get a connection, but Mary had sent out. We were going to look at Luke and John, and he says, "What does those incidents in Luke and John have to do with our study?" And I think, well, maybe we aren't really clear about why we're doing the study. There's several reasons. For one, it's something that's there that most people don't know much about. This Passover, the old, like first century Passover, it was already very old by the time the first century came along, by Jesus' time. But it's a connection to something that's been going on for literally thousands of years. And I think that's a neat thing. That's a good thing. But there's also the fact that the old Passover, the original one from Egypt, is all part of God's covenant with his people. And what we saw at the Last Supper, which you're going to talk about, which was a Passover, is that he says, "This is the new covenant in my blood." And we see by his words and over again that even though it's not the same, we're not expected today to go out and select a lamb that we own. And yet there are so many similarities. And so, I think if it's unclear the why, the idea of looking at the old Passover, first is just information, and then second, it's to understand the real, very tangible connection between Passover and the sacrifice that was made at the cross. And it's important, I think, to see those ties. So with that, you can go to the other ones.
Okay, so we're looking at Luke 2, and just a little bit, let me just read Luke 2. I'm on Luke 2, verse 41. Every year, his parents went to Jerusalem for the feast of Passover. And when he was 12 years old, they went up according to the custom of the feast. When those days were over, and they were returning home, the boy Jesus remained behind in Jerusalem. But his parents were unaware he had stayed. Assuming he was in their company, they traveled on for a day before they began to look for him among their relatives and friends. When they could not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. Finally, after 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were astounded at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. "Child, why have you done this to us?" His mother asked. "Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you looking for me?" he asked. "Did you not know that I would be in my father's house?" But they did not understand the statement he was making to them. Then he went down to Nazareth with them, and he was obedient to them. But his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. And I know we studied this recently when we studied the book of Luke, but what always intrigues me is when you're studying it from a different perspective, because now we're studying it because the reason they were there was the Passover feast, and we're talking about the Passover. So every time you study even the same passages from a different angle, there's something else I think it brings out. I think, and Scott, I'll have you turn you over to every year his parents went to Jerusalem for the feast of the Passover. Thoughts about that sentence?
Yeah, so you know the Jews, the people always need to get very legalistic. And there are a couple of things about the Passover. One of them is that by this time, they had specified that anyone who lived within 25 miles of Jerusalem had to come to Jerusalem for Passover.
Every year.
And it's just so arbitrary that, but Nazareth was 50 miles away. They didn't have to come, and they were off the hook. It says in the very beginning that Joseph was a righteous man, and this is part of it. Joseph made sure that every year they went to Jerusalem, even though they weren't required to. I'm going to give you one more example. The idea of the unleavened bread, it says when they were leaving, there wasn't time for the bread to rise, but they had by this time created a rule that says anything made out of grain, and there are 4 major grains. I don't know, wheat and spelt, and I don't remember the other ones. Doesn't matter. But anything made out of grain that wasn't cooked within 18 minutes of being exposed to water had to be thrown away. So they had taken this idea of unleavened bread to a science. You have exactly 18 minutes. So if it's gotten water on it, you got to cook it or throw it away. There was an actual law rule, 25 miles, you had to come to Jerusalem. Jesus' parents made sure that they were there. Joseph made sure they were there every single year. The rest of this, the only thing I would say about him going to the temple and saying, "Didn't you know I would be at my father's house?" And it says his parents didn't even fully understand this. There was a plan, there was a thing in motion from early on. That goes to one of Gene's questions this morning. But there was a plan that goes back to the beginning of his life, but then that goes back thousands of years. The plan was always there, and we don't always understand it. People didn't understand it. His own parents and Mary didn't understand it until much later. And I think that's the big message we have, is that this Passover is part of a larger plan.
Well, and part of some of the other rules to note on the Passover by this time. So men had to go to Jerusalem to celebrate the feast of the Passover if they were within 25 miles, and a man was considered 12 and up. So the first time Jesus went, and so women did not have to go. A lot of them, some of the things I read, a lot of women wanted to go. It was a time to get away from their everyday activities and go to Jerusalem. And as we'll see, Jerusalem, what the Passover had become by Jesus's time, it was like Mardi Gras. It describes, when I was reading some things, I said, this sounds like Mardi Gras to me. I mean, it was party central. So the women would come with their husbands, with their whole family to Jerusalem. They would buy new cookware. They would buy new clothes. They didn't bring all the food. They would buy the food there. It was getting away from where they were living. Now, I'm not saying at all that's what Jesus and Mary were doing. As Scott says, Joseph was a righteous man, and he decided, even though they lived 50 plus miles away, that it says here, his parents, so Joseph and Mary, went every year for the Passover meal. This might have been the first Passover meal Jesus went to, because, we don't know it to be a fact, but since he was Jesus and since he was raised for Joseph, I would assume that Jesus went to Jerusalem every year from the time he was 12 until the Last Supper. Is that a stretch, Scott?
It's important to understand, though, the idea of leaving the women at home, that's not God's law. That's not God's rule. That's something they created. The idea that there's a 25-mile circle around Jerusalem, they weren't even required to go to Jerusalem at all. We create stuff. And so if it seems unfair that the women were excluded, well, yeah, okay, that's not God's law. Don't ever think when you hear those kind of things, that's not God's law. That was and yes, Jerusalem was absolutely Mardi Gras. And there were people who wanted everyone to come to Jerusalem because they made a whole bunch of money. It's that simple.
And now when you think of that, this was the first time Jesus, was teaching in front of the Pharisees, and he was 12, and you think of all the people. I mean, for those of you guys who were on early, I was talking about how I'm in Galveston, and last year, 7 million people came to Galveston on tourist time. That's how Jerusalem was at this time. So there was a lot of people in Jerusalem for the Passover. So it's, now that we understand the importance of Passover, it's interesting. That's how Jesus started his ministry, I think.
Yep.
Okay, so the next passage I'm going to read is from John 2. And if you look in your Bible, this is referred to in the Bible. This story is in all 4 Gospels. I'm going to read it from John. And the first sentence says, after this. And after this, in John's Gospel, what was right before this was the wedding in Cana.
Hold on, Mary. When you turn to the side, bring that out in front of you. It's almost impossible.
Okay, sorry. Better?
Yep.
Okay. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there a few days. When the Jewish Passover was near, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found men selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and money changers seated at their tables. So he made a whip out of cord and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those selling doves, he said, "Get these out of here. How dare you turn my Father's house into a marketplace?" His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." On account of this, the Jews demanded, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do these things?" Jesus answers, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up again." "This temple took 46 years to build," the Jews replied, "and you're going to raise it up in 3 days?" But Jesus was speaking about the temple of his body. After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this. Then they believed the scriptures and the word that Jesus had spoken. While he was in Jerusalem at the Passover feast, many people saw the signs he was doing and believed in his name. But Jesus did not entrust himself to them, for he knew them all. He did not need any testimony about man, for he knew what was in a man.
So I should probably start just a short bit because this begins with after this. They had been up at Cana and Jesus had turned water into wine. And Gene wrote about this morning. I'll make it real quick, but Mary comes to him and says, hey, they're out of wine. This, at a wedding feast, to run out of wine is a real social faux pas. It would be humiliating. And she said, they're out of wine. And he says, what is this to me? Or what is this to us? My time has not yet come. And he was talking about the time where he sort of, it's not proclaims because he had done other miracles, but it's his time. No, he hadn't done other miracles. I'm sorry. The point is he's talking about this beginning of his,
Public ministry.
well, but it's his run to Jerusalem and the cross. He's going to declare things in a way that are unmistakable. And the timing begins to hang us up if we try and read this like it's a precise chronology. Mary did this week and says, well, is this the last trip to Jerusalem or the first trip? And we'll talk about that. But the point that I want to make is what we call his ministry was only 2 years, give or take a little, probably a little over 2. But he wouldn't have had time to make more than 2 or at the really most 3 trips to Jerusalem before that last one. So with that in mind, it says after this, he went to Capernaum and they stayed there a few days. And then we get this sort of gap. It says when the Jewish Passover was near, he went up to Jerusalem. I mentioned this before. People always go up to Jerusalem. And I don't care if you're coming from a place with a higher elevation. Jerusalem is looked at as a place you go up to. I think this is his last time there. But it says that he saw them in the temple courts selling sacrifices. And that is so, it is so against the why, the purpose. And it was a money-making enterprise. They set out in the temple court, in the outer court, and just piled in money. The more people that came, the more they liked it because they cashed in. And this picture of him driving them out, in the other Gospels, it talks about him tying a knot into a piece of rope, knocking over the tables, knocking over the pots of money. It's a unique picture of Jesus. The big thing I want you to see out of that, though, is the connection between Passover and what they had turned it into. It's just a party. It's an excuse to make money and it's an excuse to have a big party. That is what has happened to it. Jesus never attacked the Romans. He never told them, don't pay your tax to Rome, rise up and have a revolution. He never attacked the Romans. He did confront the people in the temple constantly, Pharisees, Sadducees, priests, you name it, because they had taken what God had told people and turned it into something different. So what you see this picture of is 2 things. It's him saying, what you've done to this Passover is wrong. But the other thing you see is that he is doing everything possible to get these people worked up into a frenzy, and they're going to kill him. It was when he told Mary, my time has not yet come, this is the time. And he says a whole bunch of things that ensure that these people are going to kill him. It is truly a sacrifice. I've said it before, they didn't take his life, he sacrificed it. But he took steps that made sure that that's how it happened.
I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Scott, I think an important thing to realize here when I was studying, so like I said, this story is in all 4 Gospels. We studied Luke, because, Scott's favorite book, but Luke, was almost a reporter. He was a doctor. He was a scientist. He did things in order for a certain reason. The book of John is written very, very differently, and it's almost written by topic, and it's not supposed to be a time. It's not necessarily in order. It's
A
in
chronology, yes.
It's not a chronology. So there's not. Once again, I think one of the big things, I was always fearful of studying the Bible too closely because I was fearful that there would be some inconsistency that I could not defend. That's our ignorance, not the fault of the Bible, is what I'm going to say. And so anyhow, it is. So if you read the same story in the synoptic gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it is definitely, it appears it's the last visit into Jerusalem. So I do not think it's an inconsistency, and as Scott says, it really doesn't matter. It was probably 2 or 3 times between the ages of when he started his public ministry and when he was put to death. There was only probably 2 or 3 times that there was a Passover meal during that time.
But the exact words spoken are different. And people love to seize on that and say, well, even the Gospels don't agree with each other. Well, these are human beings. And if you look at where they would have been in the temple court, there would have been more than one conversation. It wouldn't have been like they came up, they said one thing. People are not cameos in a sitcom. They show up, they say one thing, and then they exit stage left. So the fact that there was more than one conversation about this as it happened should not be that surprising. We lose track of the fact that this is the real world. So if the different gospels picked up on different conversations, a little different sentence, don't let it worry you. It really is not that big of a deal. The main structure of those 4 accounts is amazingly similar. The rest is just not that important.
Before I go on to food, do you want to say anything else about these 2 Bible passages?
Well, no, we did Luke and John. I'm sitting here looking at Matthew, and this is an example of what I'm talking about. When he knocked over the tables, Matthew says that he tells them, it's written, my house will be called a house of prayer, but you're making it a den of robbers. There's no reason why both of those things at some point didn't get said. Matthew, for whatever reason, took note of this. The story itself is very consistent. That's all.
So and next week we will study from a biblical standpoint Jesus' triumphal entry, which as Christians we call Palm Sunday, to Thursday, and Thursday was the Last Supper, the Passover meal, and so we'll study that from the Bible standpoint. We wanted to start with the food today because I want to send out recipes from you to choose from. I think there should be about 20 people that will be in person, and so some of these recipes, I need like 2 people to choose each of the recipes that we're talking about for when we're going to feed them, and we'll figure out. So I want to give you guys plenty of time, but I want to step back and talk about what food would be available at the time and what food was like at the time.
So I'm wrong. There is one other thing. I didn't know you were going right to that.
Okay.
I mentioned at the very beginning of this that meals are important. And through the New Testament, through the whole Bible, but through the New Testament, there are meals everywhere. And Jesus has that incident where he's eating with the tax collectors. He could have just called a meeting and called them down to someplace and talked to them, but he sat down and had a meal with them. And part of the importance of what we're trying to do with this study ending up in a Seder is that it is clear that this act of sharing the meal brings us together. It always has. I think it always will. When the kids were growing up, we had a meal at the dinner table every single night. As they've left, we've kind of gotten away from that. But that act of eating a meal together is very intimate. It's very connecting. And I do think, try and keep that in mind. When Mary talks about the food coming up, we take it for granted that if you want some food, you just run down to H-E-B. You can go to the convenience store. You can go to the food truck. And I mentioned when we first went to Israel, they left that basket with the best avocados I'd ever eaten. And 2 weeks later, there are no avocados. People didn't get stuff out of season. So when you listen to this, when you think about what we're going to be doing, and when she talks about the food, remember that food is, it was a struggle. When Jesus says, give us this day our daily bread, a lot of people live just like that. The idea that today there may not be anything, God provides. So as she talks about the food, think about the importance of these kinds of foods to the people.
So the book that I used for this part of the study is called The Food and Feasts of Jesus, if anybody's interested. And it talks about, it goes into detail of like what would have been served at the feast in Cana with the wedding. And it's just a very interesting book. These two guys spent a couple of years researching food in the first century. So that's my source if you want to know. And so if we're talking about it, and one of the things, Jesus not only had meals with people, Jesus did only have meals, but he used food as a example for many of his parables. And in the book of Luke alone, Jesus talks about having 10 different meals, and he had them with his disciples. He fed 5,000. He had meals with Pharisees, people that hated him. So, but that meal idea is so important. So, and one of the things that the subtitle of this book is The Original Mediterranean Diet with Menus and Recipes. So, first of all, the idea is it was healthy, but it's not the Mediterranean diet we know. One example I'm going to give you before we get started, there was no tomatoes or corn in the original Mediterranean diet because there was no tomatoes and corn being grown in Israel at that time. They believed that tomatoes and corn came from America and didn't get back to Israel until after America was discovered. So, when we think of the Mediterranean diet, we think of tomatoes being part of it. There was no tomatoes. But if we go over, and there was no refrigeration, so there's no preservatives. But I also think, was food tasteless? No, I mean, remember Israel was often on the spice trail, so there was a lot of spices. It wasn't that food was not good, and food was fresh, and it was healthy. The other thing to note, it was healthy for the people that had money, and once again, those that were poor did not have as healthy as a diet. So we start looking at things, grains and legumes, one of the major food groups. And in the first century, well over 50% of their calories came from grains and legumes. So bread, they had bread at every single meal. Bread was made every single day. Making of bread, huge. So one of the recipes I'm going to send out is unleavened bread. They also use, on a normal day, would have used yeast and had bread with yeast in it. But for the Passover, as we talked about before, they had unleavened bread. The legumes we're talking about, they were chickpeas, fava beans, and lentils. One of the recipes, lentils was big, and one of the recipes is lentil porridge. The only one of among you, I was talking to Jackie this week, that I think has experienced that. We did this about 6 years ago, and Jackie was a part, and she remembers making a lentil porridge at that time. Scott, did you want to add something here?
No, just that chickpeas apparently can grow on asphalt, They're they're one of those things that grow on nearly anything. If you've eaten hummus, that's just pureed chickpeas with some flavoring in it. So a lot of these things are plants that can grow just about anywhere. Beans, they didn't have a whole lot of meat, and I think Mary will talk about that. But it's mostly just that they took what they could. They took what they could get, and the poor people. It was very, very limited what they would eat. These feasts are maybe the one opportunity a year for them to have some more exciting things to eat.
So one of the reasons that grain and legumes were well over 50% of their calories, first of all, they could grow them, as Scott said, and also they could be stored for long periods of time. We
Yeah.
read examples of the rich person who wanted to build more storage for grains, so somebody who could grow it and store it could be rich, and they needed this for their food supplies, but grains could be stored for a long period of time. The next thing are vegetables, okay? Vegetables were either eaten raw, mostly eaten raw, or cooked by boiling. And they, as Scott said, they were seasonal. So whatever vegetable was available at the time, they'd eat. Now the exception, the only way they could store vegetables was to pickle them. So they had pickled vegetables.
And you pickle things in vinegar, and that's wine that's gone bad. So they had the wine to pickle. And when we have people that when we boil vegetables, they'll yell, "Oh, don't throw the water out. That's where all the nutrients are." Well, these people didn't throw the water out because it had some flavoring in it when they did cook it. I want you to kind of get a picture for what it's like to live like this. Food is such a big, part of our lives. Well, these people really had to pay attention to the food. So yeah, if they did boil vegetables, they did something with the water. They didn't throw away anything.
So we've got grains and legumes, we've got vegetables, fruits and nuts, big item in their food pyramid, if you would. Once again, seasoned. It was whatever was in season. What were big fruits in the Mediterranean? Figs and dates. Carob seeds. I was happy to hear that. So chocolate came from the very beginning, guys. And carob seeds. Olives were considered a fruit, and olives were big in the Mediterranean. Melons were probably the number one fruit that was raised in this area and consumed. There wasn't apples in this part of the world. And so these guys go into a lot about, going back to the Garden of Eden and what was the fruit. There are many people that discuss rubbing his head. But okay, but it was most likely an apricot. That's like, we don't know, we don't care. But anyhow, so it wasn't probably an apple. Apples was not part of their diet. Apricots, very much part of their diet. So we've got apricots, melons, olives, carob seeds, figs, and dates. And on fruit, the only way they could, if it wasn't seasonal, they preserved it by drying the fruit. And so they had a lot of dried fruit. Scott?
Are you going to talk about meat?
I am.
Then I'll wait for you.
Okay, meat and fish. So pork was actually very popular at this point in time, just not with Jews. I mean, Jews were prohibited to eat pork, but the Romans and the Greeks, they were eating pork. And pork was one of the big meats out there. But even rich people a rich person would probably eat meat once a week, you guys, not every meal. And we limit it to 4 ounces. We're talking meat once a week for rich people. And for poor people, as Scott said, probably just when there was festivals. So that's why these festivals and feasts were so important. It's not that they didn't like meat, but anyhow, it was probably once a time. They did eat fish, obviously, especially in this area. On the Galilee, though, what kind of fish was it? What did they call that fish that we?
Okay, now you're talking fish. I can jump in. But the meat is you can see it's a rare thing. We know people here that own beach houses, they own rent houses, and they talk about they want to use it during things like 4th of July, but they can't turn down the money. It's the same way with people who raised animals to consume, but the fishermen, the same thing. A lot of them couldn't afford to eat the fish themselves. I'm sure they had more than other people did, but the fact is they sold it to the wealthy. They sold it to the Romans, and they needed the money so much to get by, to buy lentils, that they didn't eat their own produce that often. The fact that it didn't keep very long also meant you had to sell it, but a lot of those fishermen rarely ate, infrequently ate even the fish that they caught. So it was there, but it was salted, dried, a whole different thing. But the big thing to understand is these people are very poor, and they just couldn't get their hands on meat or fish. But you said what kind of fish? Jewish law says that fish must have scales. They're not allowed to eat shrimp. They're not allowed to eat clams. It has to be fish, and they must have scales. When we were in Jerusalem, we went to the Sea of Galilee, and we didn't bring our fishing poles, and there are catfish in there everywhere, this long. I mean, my arms you can't see them. Big catfish. And we threw some fried chicken, and it must have called 50 of these giant catfish up. We could have sat there and caught them till our arms were tired. The people who live there, the Jews, they eat carp. They eat mullet. They eat something called St. Peter's fish, but the fish must have scales, and they won't touch the catfish. I said something about catching them, and those guys gave me this horrible, horrible look. So we laugh sometimes about people in India that are literally starving, and they won't touch a cow. But these people will not touch a fish that doesn't have scales. So, the dietary restrictions are also really important.
On their meat, they would use every part of the meat. Obviously the skins were important. And we'll talk about, the sacrifice, when they sacrificed the lamb at Passover. Sometimes the priest would keep the skins. Sometimes they'd get the skins back and use that as payment for whatever housing they were staying during Passover. So obviously the skins were important, but they would crush the bones. They would take a hammer and crush the bones and get the marrow out. So, beef broth or bone broth, which is all the rage right now for health standpoints, they would do that. But they would also powder the bones and use that. I don't know what they'd use it for, some kind of food thing, right, Scott?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they would use every part of the meat, but they would eat, like I said, the people that were not rich would probably eat meat a handful of times during the year. And one of this was this unblemished lamb that they would have eaten for the Passover feast. So the Passover feast was wonderful for these people. Milk, they did drink it, but they would have, since there's no refrigeration, they would have to drink it quickly. It was often served for guests that would come, but it was mainly used to make other food products, such as cheese and yogurt. Thoughts on that?
Things that keep. I mean, that's the bottom line. There is a sense of urgency. I talked about Jesus eating with the tax collectors, but you're right. He also ate with the Pharisees. They wanted to trap him, but they invited him to a meal because the meal is this social setting. But there's a sense of urgency for most people around meals that we don't understand. It's important to understand, if we're going to really look at Passover, if we're going to really look at what was going on, that this was, you understand why it turned into a celebration, because they got a chance they saved up their money for this one chance a year.
And wine, big deal. We'll see on July 4th, April 14th, I'll get it yet, when we celebrate the Passover meal. Those who are staying in Rockport either have a designated driver or stay close, because it's 4 glasses of wine. Now, saying is during the Passover meal, but saying that the consumption of wine was from children all the way up. One of the main reasons they didn't understand the antibacterial effect of wine to water. The water was not clean. And so they did know people would get sick and die from drinking water, and they needed liquid. So from a very young age, children would drink wine, but it would be, and everybody would drink wine that was very watered down. Excuse me. The richer you were, the less watered down the wine was. So a normal household was 2 to 1. So they would put half water and half wine in it. If you were wealthier, it was 3 to 2, 5 to, whatever, a smaller percentage of the wine. The wine, when we hear of someone having kosher wine now and celebrating a Passover, we think of Concord grape wines. That is not a first century wine deal. There was no Concord grapes in Israel at the time. They believe that I'm going to read from here just a sec. I marked the page and then I lost it. Sorry.
Muscat.
Muscat and Shiraz.
Shiraz.
Shiraz is the other one. And so those were Shiraz and the sweet Muscat were believed to be the 2 types of grapes that were widely used and loved in the ancient Middle East, with the Shiraz grape originally coming from the area of Shiraz, Iran. And they believe that for centuries after the death of Jesus, even after the Muslim conquest, that small vineyards that provided wine for Jews and Christians still, still living in the region. Some vineyards were still there when the Crusaders invaded the Middle East. And it was believed that those Shiraz grapes were actually brought into other parts of the world and that they were kept. And that's how the Shiraz grapes were started. But this wine use was, and they said the amount of wine that was drunk by people in the first century per capita would have been higher than France would be today. I mean, these people drank wine, but they drank it as watered down and they put spices in it oftentimes. What would you like to add, Scott?
The spices, the wine begins to go bad, it turns to vinegar. A lot of it's not very good to begin with, because remember, to get wine to really go, you've got to have high sugar content. So sometimes the wine was so bad they would put spices in it, and one of them was this stuff that's basically creosote. And if you can imagine, I always think how horrible would that be? But the alternative is pretty nasty water a lot of the time. So things that settle out of the wine, it's preferable. It is just to kind of get you to understand how special this day would have been in Jesus' time. It's a big deal.
So the menu for the Passover, and like I said, I will send out all the recipes by email later this evening. But we have unleavened bread, bitter herbs and salt water, vinegar dip, sprinkled vegetables spring vegetables for dipping, which include parsley, green onions, and radishes, brined olive, charosette, which is my favorite. Anybody who knows me knows I love sweet things. And this is the dried fruit and honey and it has some wine in it, and they use this set to put on their bread and on their lamb, and is delicious. Hard boiled eggs, Boulgard and chard. Um, Scott's like, what am I going to eat? Lentil porridge, pottage, and roasted leg of lamb. And so we are going to get some leg of lamb, and we're going to roast it. And Jack is going to help us, right, Jack? Jack and Laura are going to be in town, and we're going to roast the leg of lamb. And remember, they had to eat all of the meat that night. So they had to not cook too much. And it sounded like it wouldn't be a problem because they couldn't afford too much. But everybody had to have a portion of lamb. And like I said, after 70 AD, they stopped doing the whole lamb, and because they didn't have the sacrifice at the temple anymore. Thoughts about the
When we were, well, when we were in Israel, we stayed at a place right by the Dead Sea, and they had a breakfast. It was like a breakfast buffet, and you would not believe what a breakfast buffet looks like in Israel. They have this big tray out there, and they have tuna fish, and they have avocado, and they have hummus. You know how if you go to a taco restaurant here, you're going to get salsa, little cups, whether you want it or not. Everything gets, well, everything there, they put hummus on. If you go to McDonald's, you have to tell them, hold the hummus. But this tray looks nothing like anything you would recognize as breakfast food. And that's just the way they eat. They're a lot healthier than we are. Part of why I want to keep coming back to it, we're trying to connect to something that is thousands of years old. And so I still think it's good for us to have that, to feel that connection, to at least have a picture for the elements that are the same and the elements that are different. And we're going to do our best to keep elements the same if we can.
A couple of things they only had one meal a day, and it was an early evening meal. Remember, when it got dark, it was dark, and also was candles, and we'll have candle lighting on the 14th. And so, but it was an early evening meal. Does that mean they only ate once a day? Some people only ate once a day, but their breakfast or lunch or their food during the day were snacks. They were out working, and they would eat some fruit and some nuts usually as part of those other snacks. But they had one meal a day. How did they seat? I was reading that they would have low benches and low chairs, no dining room tables like we had, and this idea that you see them sitting on the floor, leaning on their left side, using their right hand side. The only time they would have lounged on pillows in the first century, which we're not going to do because Scott won't let me, is during a feast like the Passover. But otherwise, they'd either squat down or sit on a low bench and eat. It was family style extraordinaire in the fact that they didn't have silverware as such. If they had spooning instruments, it was only, they would use their bread as their spoon and eat with their hands. There was a lot of hand washing during the meal, because that's how they would clean their, put a pitcher of water and wash their hands. So silverware was not a thing, and dining room tables were not a thing. Scott's making a frowny face.
No, the bit about the silverware, about them sharing a bowl and using their hands and all that, yeah, we have a hard time with it. But do you have anything else just on the food? Because there's one last thing, and we're close on time.
The other thing I'm going to say, I'm very excited. Those of you who are away, I'm going to ship them to you. But we have gotten clay cups made. that would be like a wine. They were like we've gone back to stemless wine cups, glasses. We have stemless clay cups. That would have been like the first century clay cups.
Unglazed.
Unglazed, so the wine will sink in and stain the cups. But I'll ship it to you, those guys who can't be present, but those who are present, we will have clay cups to drink our wine out of. Sorry, go ahead.
So the big thing that I hope we can get from this and keep in mind is that this feast was a remembrance. This feast was designed through the centuries to keep them connected, to remind them that they were delivered from Egypt, that God set up this whole thing to bring his people out of Egypt. It was a deliverance, and it is absolutely designed to never forget, to remember what happened. Carol Kutnick mentioned that she has friends, relatives, and she always wanted to be part of their Passover Seder. And they always tell her no, that this is just their family, their group. And she's a little put off, I think. I'm not going to put words in her mouth, but the idea is you can't remember something that you never experienced. And to keep these people as one people, even when they're dispersed all over the world, this remembrance is part of that. It had kept them one people. We're going to be trying to recreate something that's ancient, that has bound people for thousands of years. The point, though, is if I've mentioned how many of the elements of Passover exactly foreshadow the sacrifice that Messiah makes, that Jesus makes, they're impossible to ignore. And we see in that like Carol's friends who said, you're not going to be there remembering the Passover. You're not part of us. You weren't delivered. And the Jews always see themselves as being a continued part of one they're all one, whether they're across the world or whether they're removed by 1,000 years, they're one people. And that message is not meant to be ugly. You can't remember something that you never experienced. We move forward now. Use this as a reminder that when Jesus says this, what we call Last Supper, what we observe as communion, is a new covenant in my blood. That's as opposed to the old covenant and the blood that they put on the doorpost. There's about to be a new Passover. And this one opens up not just to the Jews, but to everybody. But the parallel is not an accident. Jean asked me in the email, was a Passover required? Did there have to be a Passover for this to happen? And my response was it required by whom? God didn't require it. This was done this way. If you read what we read today and a bunch of other places, people saw these things, and it says, then they believed. They saw him do certain things, say certain things, then they believed. And this is absolutely one of these things that's an affirmation to us weak humans that there has been a plan in place since the beginning, that we're a part of it just as much as the people in the old books of the Old Testament were a part of it. And so this remembrance is an exact, almost perfect parallel to the remembrance that they maintained through the Passover feast for thousands of years. What we see in our day with us observing the Last Supper, he comes right out and tells us, this is the new covenant in my blood. So try and see that too, the parallels the things that bind us together, the things that show us that God has made us a part of a plan. The Passover, for him to be in Jerusalem for Passover, was not required for him to make the sacrifice. That's for us. It's to remind us and to show us this is exactly what's been going on. It's to help our faith. It's to give us the ability to understand and believe. So, anything else, Mary?
So I'm going to send out an email for those who I believe are coming in person, and I will put the different things. And on this one, you can reply. I don't usually like reply all, but I'm going to say reply all so I can have an idea of, like I said, we're aiming to feed 20 people. We've got the lamb covered, and the rest of the things. And I'm not a cook. So if I was on the other end of this and I didn't have my lamb count for my contribution, it's okay if you can't make unleavened bread to go find, the best, closest thing to what is unleavened bread, and the same with brined olives. I am not someone that there's a rule. If you don't make it this way, you can't come. That's not it. But I am going to put the recipes out there for those of you who are cooks and can help.
This part is fun for us. If you can't be here in person, please join in by Zoom. What I've tried to make people understand about even communion, it's not anybody in this world can eat some bread and drink some wine. Anybody. The idea of the communion, the thing that binds us together, is the remembrance. So if you can't be here in person, no problem, but try and do it in person. It makes us a part, it shows us as being a part of something that goes all the way back. And it's good for us to be together, even if it's on the screen.
Closing prayer.
God, you've given us a way to see ourselves as part of your family. You call us your children, but you've given us a way that we can see each other as part of that family. And it's good. We're thankful for it. We look for the vision and the wisdom to see the thing that has been set apart for us as a reminder of your goodwill. We're thankful for all the reminders that we get. We know we don't always see them, but this one, we ask your presence to make us absolutely feel and see your presence. Be with us this week as we have those opportunities to bring your grace and your goodness to a world that needs it. Amen.
Thank you, guys.
And now I'm supposed to unmute everybody?
They can unmute themselves.
They can unmute themselves?
Yes.
I hope that wasn't too, for some people, I know studies like that are kind of dry, but I hope it wasn't too bad. I'm looking forward to the Seder meal.
So we have one more Sunday, though, so we're going to do the next week.
Hey, Scott, I got a quick story.